Good morning, everybody. I'll wait for people to take their seats, but as you're taking your seats, let me welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Andrew Seeley. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Wilson Center. I'm giving you greetings on behalf of Jane Harmon, our president, who is teaching a course up at Harvard today at the law school and couldn't be with us, but sends her greetings. Today, we're very lucky to work with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. This is a partnership that we've been planning for a while. We're glad this is actually the second in a series of 3 things that we were doing together. I think the first time we're working together on Asia, which is fabulous, and we very much look forward to working with FPRI a lot more in the future. A great think tank that does work and research center that does work out of Philadelphia and shares many of the same interests and concerns we do about trying to broaden our understanding of issues around the world. And they, like us, have a particular commitment on Asia. Jack DeLille, who runs their Asia program, will say a little more about today's conference. Let me say that clearly, as a American foreign policy for many decades has been largely looked eastward towards Europe, towards concerns in Russia, the Middle East. That is not going to change. My sense is we will always have great allies in Europe. We will always have concerns eastward across the Atlantic. But increasingly, I think as a country, we're beginning to look both westward and southward. We're beginning to look at the Americas, which is our home hemisphere, and particularly at Asia, and a sense that Asia is where the most dynamic economies are, that there is, in fact, changing geopolitics in which Asia is going to play a principal role in the future. It's no coincidence that our president, who has talked about rebalancing towards Asia, himself grew up in the Pacific, in Hawaii, and briefly in Indonesia. But this is a long-term process, and it's something that affects all of us, beginning to look westward across the Pacific and not only eastward across the Atlantic. However, the meaning of what rebalancing or pivoting to Asia means towards whom and for what purpose are obviously contentious concepts. These are not things that in and of themselves are self-evident. And so today's conference, I think we're going to have a great opportunity to look at what the challenges, what the meaning, and what the potential and possibilities of these new relationships are in this new focus. Let me just recognize Robert Daly here, who's the director of our Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and Chihoko Goto, senior associate in the Asia program. And thank you to both of them for organizing today's event on our side. And let me turn it over to Jacques.
Thank you, Andrew, for hosting us here. Thanks to Chihoko for all that she did in making this possible, and to others at the Wilson Center who've given us this terrific venue and have done so much of the work to make this possible. Thanks also to my fellow senior fellows at FPRI who are thickly represented on the panel here, and especially to other scholars and experts who joined us without the pre-existing institutional obligation. I mean, this really, I think, is an all-star cast to address the issues we've got before us in terms of strategic rebalancing and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, assessing security and trade policy toward Asia, U.S. policy. On the security side, of course, we're a few years into what was initially called the pivot and then quickly redubbed rebalancing toward Asia in U.S. foreign policy. And we're more than 5 years into the period when the then new administration announced the U.S. was back in Asia, meaning East Asia. We'd been in West Asia pretty densely in the preceding years, or that we had never left Asia in the other formulation used at the time. On the economic side, we're in the midst of a long developing and much discussed Trans-Pacific Partnership, a massive trade agreement that would link the U.S. and many of the largest economies in the region, and a fairly high-quality trade agreement in the sense of being quite liberalizing, albeit not a full-fledged free trade agreement. Both sets of policies, that is on the security and the economic side, are being pursued in a particularly challenging and fast-changing set of circumstances that are familiar to everybody in this room. On the security side, of course, rebalancing occurs in the face of China's rapid rise in capacity and sharply growing concerns among its neighbors and in the United States about China's will or intent. This has been most dramatically on display, of course, in the East China Sea disputes with Japan and the South China Sea disputes with Philippines, Vietnam, and others, although there's much else one could add to the list. The cross-strait relationship is actually one of the quiet spots, but we've got elections coming up in Taiwan, and who knows what that will do on that front. More nationalist politicians have come to power, particularly in Japan, which has added to the concerns. And of course, North Korea is the gift that keeps on giving in terms of security concerns in the region. And of course, there are crises and problems outside the region that threaten to distract from rebalancing. ISIS, Ebola, Russia, the Ukraine, a long list of such issues that pose challenges for any pivot or rebalancing. On the economic side, of course, the TPP is inevitably difficult, as all massive trade agreements are, but it also faces particularly serious opposition at home, as trade agreements quite often do, but as the TPP does for reasons specific to its content and also its process, and of course the challenges of trying to do this with a Congress that seems not terribly well inclined toward free trade agreements, and when you've got a weak economy that raises concerns among those who might be losers under a trade agreement. And of course, it happens in an era when the WTO process is pretty badly stalled post-Doha. And of course, we're also in an era when the TPP is competing with other regional trade agreements, most notably the RCEP, the somewhat lower quality trade agreement in terms of liberalization, but that puts China more or less at the center, unlike the TPP, which at least in its initial round will exclude China. Well, that's, even though I've gone on a bit longer than I'd hoped, that's of course still only a very partial and select list of the issues on the table here that matter for U.S. security and economic policy toward Asia as the Obama administration enters its final 2 years in office and likely enters those 2 years with a more Republican Congress. And it also, of course, is a moment when we're about to have the next APEC meeting, which President Obama will head off for in less than 2 weeks. So there is a lot to discuss here. Fortunately, we have an ample slate of leading scholars and analysts of these issues to address them today, and we have a full day to do it. One final thing is that one of our hopes for the day is that we'll explore some of the connections between the security side and the economic side. We have split the day in half, but with any luck, some of our panelists and some of you in raising questions will draw some of those connections, and even if you don't, I think it will just emerge organically as we think through the issues. In some sense, that theme is a return to the last Washington conference that we held for FPRI, the great divergence between the political security side of relations and the economic side of relations in the region. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our first panel, because you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from them. So I'd ask the first panel to come up and take the stage. Thanks.
Good morning. Welcome. My name is Robert Daly. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. I think it's interesting in a broad discussion like the one planned for today that comprises all of Asia, that we're beginning with implications for U.S.-China relations. And this points us right at one of the key questions of how the pivot rebalance was framed. The policy was announced in October of 2011 by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Foreign Policy magazine in an article titled America's Pacific Century. And this policy was put forward after about 18 months, different people time this differently, but of increasing Chinese assertiveness in the Western Pacific. And I think we have to remember that context when we look back at Secretary Clinton's announcement. And in that article, she wrote, "As the war in Iraq winds down and America begins to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, the United States stands at a pivot point. Over the last 10 years, we have allocated immense resources to those two theaters. In the next 10 years, we need to be smart and systematic about where we invest time and energy so that we put ourselves in the best position to sustain our leadership, secure our interests, and advance our values. One of the most important tasks of American statecraft over the next decade will therefore be to lock in a substantially increased investment, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and otherwise, in the Asia-Pacific region." The components of this new approach, according to Secretary Clinton in that article at the time, there were 6 major courses of action: the strengthening of bilateral security alliances, the deepening of relationships with rising powers, including China, engagement with regional multilateral institutions, the expansion of trade and investment, the forging of a broad-based military presence, and the advancement of democracy and human rights in the region. And this also then came to include, this approach, the decision to become a member of the East Asia Summit and the plans to develop further the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This announcement, Secretary Clinton's, which was then echoed by others in the administration, got China's attention immediately. And China's there were voices immediately in China which saw this as a bold-faced announcement of what had long been suspected, namely an attempt to contain China. And in part to try to counter that assessment on the part of the Chinese, we switched our terminology and pivot became the rebalance as part of an effort to convince people in China that this new policy was not aimed at them. And this then became a claim regularly made by American officials and analysts. Joseph Yun, then acting assistant secretary at the Department of State in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, in his testimony before the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee in 2003 said, multilateral cooperation very much includes China. So this is not aimed at you, this is for you, in fact. We want gift. We want China and the countries of the region to partner not only with us, but with each other and multilaterally, so that we can deal with shared challenges like cybersecurity, climate change, and North Korea. And I think that attempt to broaden and explain the policy was quite sincerely meant. How is that claim that this is aimed at China going in China? I think we'd say mixed at best. There are a growing but still small number of people with voices in China who think that perhaps the rebalance might hold opportunities for China and that it isn't purely a policy of containment. But I think it's safe to say that most Chinese are still very skeptical about this claim. Whether or not it is true that the rebalance is not aimed at China, it is certainly not convincing to date within China. There's an old Chinese story that these claims call to mind, that are protesting too much call to mind. 此地无银三百两, right, for the Chinese speakers in the audience. And this is an old story where a miser has 300 taels of silver and buries them in the ground to save them, and he's afraid that somebody is going to find them. And so he puts a sign up in the earth over the space where he buried them that says, 300 taels of silver are not buried here. It's just protesting too much. And the end of the story is he comes back the next day and there's another sign that says, Wang, the thief, did not steal your silver. But all of these protests that it's not aimed at China for Chinese who believe this is about containment only reconfirms 此地无银三百两 that in fact this is precisely what it's about. I think that we may need to adjust the way we describe this to the Chinese. I'll be interested in your views on this. It seems to me that it would be prudent to admit at the very least that China's rise was the primary impetus for our renewed commitment to the region, at the very least. But we can talk about that. And Chinese see also in our statements about the rebalance what from their point of view is a little bit of a poison pill, and it's Secretary Clinton's sixth point about advancing democracy and human rights, or as Assistant Secretary Yun put it in his testimony, at the heart of our efforts to contribute to a peaceful, prosperous, secure, and stable region is a desire to expand democratic development and human rights. This, again, in Beijing, in my experience, in my conversation, sounds to many people like a barely disguised call for changes so fundamental and so fast that they amount very nearly to regime change. And I think that this suspicion is particularly true under the Xi Jinping government, which has been more than usually suspicious of U.S. intentions. Western values, in fact, which is more or less code language for American cultural and institutional influence, is one of the non-traditional threats that will be addressed by the new National Security Commission, which Xi Jinping himself heads up, lumped together with terrorism and splitism, essentially sedition. So we have now, since the announcement of the rebalance, a new administration which is extremely suspicious of American motives and which is actually building new institutions to counter them. So we on the American side, we speak of a rebalance. China speaks of a new model of major power relations. I think both sides question the utility, the intentions, and even the reality of the other's key phrase and its associated policies. There is, in these questions, a tremendous amount at stake. It's not just a question of the legitimization of one side's phrase or formula. It's a question, as always, of the intelligent management of U.S.-China relations. And I'm very delighted that we have two of America's leading experts with us this morning to help us make sense of this. Bonnie Glaser is Senior Advisor for Asia and Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she specializes in Chinese foreign and security policy. Prior to joining CSIS, she was a long-time and highly valued consultant at the Departments of Defense, and the Department of State, as well as other agencies. And she's a fellow graduate of SICE, so it's nice to have another SICE up here. And also, I'd been listening to Bonnie's presentations for a number of years before I came here. And I always enjoyed it because you were always the namer of the elephant in the room, especially when we have Chinese and Americans in the same conference. These are usually highly circumspect discussions, and they're spoken about in coded language. And again, I mean, not only do you find the elephant in the room, but you spray paint it bright red, and you haul it onto the stage and dissect it in the best analytical tradition and serve it up. And again and again, for many years, I've been in these conferences, and it's been something that you've said, that's exactly it. That is what needs to be brought out, and the earlier in the conference, the better. So I trust that you will do that again for us this morning. Jonathan Pollack is Senior Fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute. There he specializes in East Asian international politics and security, Chinese political military strategy, U.S.-China relations, and the political and security issues in the Korean Peninsula. I come to China knowing far less than I should about North Korea, and whenever there's a major incident, I'll look for your writings first. So you're one of the go-to guys on that issue in particular. In January of 2014, early this year, he and Jeffrey Bader at the Brookings Institute wrote, I thought, a particularly good public memo to President Obama called The Return to the Asia Rebalance. And I'd be interested in knowing if you think that any of that has changed. I thought the recommendations at the time were spot on. And in that memo you wrote, just to refresh your memory, we cannot neglect the fact that our standing in the region has suffered serious damage because of the dysfunction of our political system, which has been on full display over the past year. In the absence of meaningful progress on these issues, Asians will not be satisfied with rhetoric or roadmaps. They take a hard-headed view of our capabilities and actions, and they have not been impressed by the U.S. political process and the limitations it imposes on the vigorous pursuit of U.S. interests. And so that's another feature of this discussion. What are we capable of? How does our domestic politics influence our policy in China? So with that, we will hear first from Jonathan and then from Bonnie, and then we'll have time for discussion with all of you. So Jonathan, please.
Do I have to? Oh, yes, I'm on. Okay, thank you. Robert, thank you very, very much for those warm words of introduction, and I hope I don't disappoint. My thanks also to FPRI for the invitation to be here today, as well as to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I've entitled my talk, Revisiting the Rebalance, and I'm a reader of documents, dry policy documents, political speeches of one kind or another, because words count and they reveal underlying assumptions and the like. The rebalance, of course, if we can call it that for the moment, has been subject of a lot of debate and consideration ever since it was rolled out. I would argue, actually, its underpinnings were there from the very first days of the administration. It simply was not articulated as such in a major policy statement until the two simultaneous developments, the article in Foreign Policy Magazine that Robert Daly referred to, and of course the President's own trip, and in particular his visit to the Australian Parliament, which, so far as I can determine, is the only major speech President Obama has ever given on this. He has left it to others in the National Security Council, Department of Defense, Department of State to make speeches. Interestingly enough, President Obama not only does not use the word pivot, he never uses the word imbalance, rebalance. It's missing. If anyone is identified with the label of rebalance, it would be Tom Donilon, who was a national security advisor at the time, and he, of course, has repeated in a variety of his speeches. Looking at Secretary Clinton's speech at the time, she mentions pivot 3 times, and in other speeches she mentions a pivot point. She also alludes to another phrase that didn't capture any attention. She twice refers to a strategic turn. That's turn, T-U-R-N, not T-E-R-N. Now the question is, do these words have meaning? I would say that certainly those in China and elsewhere peer over these words in great detail, trying to infer very, very specific meaning, whether they have it or not. But it does remind us that words do count. But there's some basic questions we ought to ask first. What was the rebalance? I don't want to reiterate what Robert just said, but there were some underlying assumptions that I think enable us to understand some of the directions. Was it a true strategy? There is an open argument, I think. Bonnie's colleague, Michael Green, made some very, very relevant points about this in an event at CSIS. I stumbled on the text of it the other day, that it wasn't the product of any kind of elaborate strategy planning process, the kinds of things that we often associate with fundamental changes in policy. And indeed, and I don't want to say that it's a bit like Moliere's bourgeois gentleman who discovered he'd been speaking prose all his life. The reality is, most of what is in the content of the document, not all of it, the content of the policy, you can find ample antecedents in prior administrations, and I'll talk more a bit about that. There is, though, the element of marketing, and I think that Secretary Clinton was particularly prominent in this. The problem, however, with marketing and with words is that there are expectations that are generated as a consequence of those words. And we'll have to look at some of the liabilities as well as some of the possibilities that are associated with that. I'll try to take a little time to ask what has been achieved. I don't want to give this concept a report card as such, but if you look at the larger goals around which this policy emerged and evolved, and indeed I would note here, although the program today is divided between security in the morning and economics and trade in the afternoon, I think consistently everyone in the administration makes no such distinction. The presumption is that a rebalance involves the totality of these policies across a wide range of areas. And then finally, we might want to ask how the rebalance will affect legacy building for President Obama as he approaches his last 2 years in office, beginning, of course, with his impending visit to China, to Burma, and to Australia in coming weeks. And in that context, what it implies for the U.S.-China relationship. Now, all presidential administrations label their policies, even if the policies are rarely tabula rasa. President Obama made this very, very clear from an early point. He aspired to a very, very different concept of American interest in the Asia-Pacific region. This was, again, outlined very, very fully in his speech to the Australian Parliament. It was premised on a belief, and Donilon has also articulated this, that we were overinvested in wars in the Middle East and needed to make some kind of an exit or escape from those conflicts. That there may have been an expectation in the early phase of the rebalance policy that the existence of multilateral institutions in Europe was sufficient, that the United States in some measure could shift its attention, its resources, its time and energy to questions of where these multilateral relationships were less fully developed. He clearly believed that the center of economic and strategic gravity was moving to the Asia-Pacific region. We use this label Asia, of course, and then that always begs the issue, which part of this giant elephant do you have in mind in that process? And of course, it involved the effort to incorporate China in a more rules-based order while simultaneously enhancing and reinvigorating relations with U.S. allies in the region. Now, frankly, a lot of these are kind of hardy perennials. Every administration says it values its allies. What we can, however, say is that the preoccupations with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, had really turned executive branch attention in some measure away in a day-to-day basis from what were developments in Asia, or in articulating a strategic logic for it. Under the George H.W. Bush administration and continuing under the Clinton administration, there were regular documents, planning documents that were released and issued related to East Asia in particular, less to South Asia. These came to a halt in the George W. Bush administration. I don't say that to fault them. I'm just simply describing it, that the judgment was made that maybe they weren't really needed. Maybe what you had was good enough. But President Obama, as someone who had spent a lot of time as a young man living in Asia, saw and articulated a belief that this is where the American strategic future was. But it was a very aspirational document. It wasn't, here's a to-do list as such. It was more, if you will, some kind of a vision. Now, there were other words in his speech to the Australian Parliament which I think are worthy of quoting and may explain something about Chinese reactions to the document. I'm quoting the president. He's talking about all these, the need for economic growth here at home and how Asia is linked to that. And then this brings me to the final area where we are leading, our support for the fundamental rights of every human being. Every nation will chart its own course, yet it is also true that there are certain rights that are universal. Among them, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and the freedom of citizens to choose their own leaders. These are not American rights or Australian rights or Western rights. These are human rights. They stir in every soul, and we've seen in the democracies that they have succeeded here in Asia. Other models have been tried and they have failed. Fascism and communism. Rule by one man and rule by committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it highlights the fact that in some measure we were trying to reconcile, or the administration was trying to reconcile, a set of policy goals that, as often in these composite presentations of policy, take you in very, very different directions. In any event, over time, the idea of a rebalance strategy put forward in every element of national power, as it was put by Tom Donilon, as mentioned before, alliances, emerging nations other than China, deeper involvement in global and regional institutions, and more of a U.S. presence in terms of high-level visits and the like in the Asia-Pacific region. Involvement more in multilateral institutions, particularly in Southeast Asia, which has long been drawn to those kinds of institutions. Stable and constructive relations with China, but mentioned as a separate category from other emerging nations. And of course, the need for a new economic architecture beyond what we had. All of these, again, in some sense made sense, but as I said, they were more aspiration than strategy. They were not part of an elaborate planning process, but that China was put in a category all its own. This singularization of China, I don't think, was reflecting some kind of deep impulse towards quote-unquote containment. That's a label that gets tossed around a lot. It's subject to a variety of definitions. But it did reflect, I think, in some sense, a belief that there needed to be some redirection in a more total package, if you will, that the administration would try to pursue. A lot of attention, of course, has focused on the military dimension here. And again, in retrospect, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that attention was drawn in the media, in the commentary world, if you will, to questions related to U.S. military power and deployments. It's worthy of note that a lot of the goals that were articulated here, a shift over time in the balance of U.S. forces deployed to the Pacific, long antedates the Obama administration. Robert Gates, in one of his last speeches before he stepped down as Secretary of Defense, reminded everyone and this is again was also a long-term goal, the United States is moving to a more geographically distributed, operationally resilient, and politically sustainable force posture in the region. And by that he meant, in many respects, going beyond our traditional focus on Northeast Asia. So how do we see things as they stand now? How am I doing in time, Robert? I don't want to exceed it.
8 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. The degree of commitment to this in high-level speeches and the like necessarily has led people, many in Asia, to judge the virtues or values of this strategy, if we could call it that. Ironically, however, I think that the two places that are the biggest believers that there is something really here that is sustainable and substantial are found in China and in North Korea. If you ask elsewhere in Asia, it is not that people do not, or countries do not want the United States present and accounted for. They do, but there are growing doubts that, in effect, the desire to shift the pattern of investment will prove sustainable over time. Why? Because the premises of rebalance assumed that other kinds of perturbing events would not affect the ability of the United States to focus on this region. Those have not been validated. It's not faulting the administration. The reality is events often drive strategy and strategic directions, but fundamentally the inability of the United States to make an exit, graceful or otherwise, from what we'll simply call the greater Middle East, and the breakdown of understandings in the security order and arrangements post-Cold War in Central Europe with Mr. Putin's activism on various fronts, undermined central premises that, in effect, in the view of the administration, would enable it to focus more of its attention on the Asia-Pacific region. There is, in addition, as Robert reminded me, are those stirring words that Jeff and I offered in January, and we would hold to them. And this is an open question, because if it's not so much your words and your statements, but rather what you can demonstrate in action, this is not, shall we say, the American democratic system at its finest. Moreover, I would argue that underlying all of this and underlying the president's convictions about Asia really were at bottom a set of convictions about economic power more than anything else. This is what, in essence, he was saying: if the future of the global economy is going to be based increasingly in the Asia-Pacific region, and the United States has to be there, it will require a set of arrangements and relationships and understandings that will enable free and fair economic competition. And that presumably is what, on the one hand, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is supposed to achieve, as well as understandings and relationships that are under negotiation with China, specifically a bilateral investment treaty. Suffice it to say, those are much harder to do in practice than they are in theory, although, as my colleague Jeff Bader reminds me, and Jeff spent a lot of time in trade negotiations, he says, all trade agreements look absolutely impossible until you cut that final deal. Now, my point would be, if TPP in particular continues to flounder, continues not to be able to get to closure, and this is a closure, of course, that involves very fundamentally Japan, then the true underpinnings of this larger effort to reorient American strategy will be called into increasing question. So that has to be a core goal, it seems to me, for the president's last 2 years in office. He originally had anticipated and even spoke publicly that we would have a deal by the end of 2013. Well, we didn't. We don't have a deal near the end of 2014 either. And it's a reminder that, again, the relationship between the aspirations of a policy and the means and the mechanisms to get you there and to demonstrate that you're making headway toward those larger goals really is very, very much required. Now, what about China? I'll make a very few short comments about China because Bonnie will cover this in greater depth. I think it's fair to say, as Robert noted, that the ascendance of China was one of the triggering factors that led to the articulation of the rebalance policy. There was obviously a concept related to China or a set of goals related to China embedded in most of these speeches and policy documents, which, to be frank, if we look at it and if we look at the bilateral relationship today, we really can't say that we're there yet. It doesn't mean that our policy with China is some massive failure. It's not, I don't believe. It's a very, very complex relationship, as we all know. There are areas of real success. Ironically enough, for all of the concern about strategic suspicions and the nascent dimensions of a long-term military rivalry, I would say that in the last several years, developments in the military-to-military relationship have been more pronounced and more sustained than at any time in a number of years. And I don't think people would necessarily have predicted that a few years ago. But we clearly, if we look at both our aspirations and the fact that the goal or the intent to vest China in a set of larger strategic and institutional understandings remains, at best, shall we say, incomplete or to be determined. At the same time as the Chinese are in their own ways, under Xi Jinping, beginning to articulate institutional aspirations of various kinds that may not be necessarily at cross purposes to existing arrangements, but don't mesh fully or satisfactorily. Now, the question is always what do you do about it? And maybe we can talk about that in the discussion this morning. I don't think anyone is saying that, in effect, writing off this long-term effort to engage with China. Quite the contrary. But I think we are much more sober-minded and mindful of just how long-term a process this is going to be. That again, President Obama at different times has talked about how a lot of his aspirations aren't goals only for his own administration, but the things will be sustained over time. So in any event, rather than take too much more time, I would just close with a couple of observations about the focus on the security dimension that has been that's a theme here of the panel this morning. The Pentagon does a lot of planning, and because it is such a large institution, you can trigger or stimulate those kinds of developments in a whole host of ways. And I think that if looking at rebalance as the umbrella policy, if you will, of the administration, separate bureaucracies necessarily go their own way, hopefully in a coordinated fashion. I don't think any of us should be surprised by this, but I do think to some meaningful degree, the military component of the rebalance seemed to dominate so much of the public discussion. I don't think that was ever the president's intention, because it really was triangulated. It was military security, it was political diplomatic, and it was economic. And all of these are different kinds of paths, but unless you see something that is sustained across all of those dimensions in policy, then you'd have to wonder whether or not it really, the policy has some kind of overall coherence. So that will be the larger long-term test, but I don't think it should surprise anyone. And indeed, even in Asia, as there are doubts about the ability of the United States to sustain this kind of a policy, we need to be frank. The very fact that there are growing concerns about Chinese power all across the Asia-Pacific region is a principal reason why the United States is so welcome on such a widespread basis. So in any event, there's a lot more work to be done. I would only note also that the expectations of revived alliances are still an open question, frankly, in a number of respects. So government work is hard, but it certainly the administration's policies have concentrated the time and the minds of many, many people on that long-term question of American strategy in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite those of you who are seated at the back or on the sides or skulking in doorways to come down. In fact, there are many reasonably comfortable chairs. Please come on in and find yourselves a seat. Maybe if some of you who are at the aisles could squeeze into the middle, that would be helpful. There are a lot of people here at the edges. So come on down. All right, thank you. Bonnie.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and FPRI for asking me to speak and for holding what is, I think, an important conference today to talk about the intersection of some of these security and economic issues that relate to the rebalance to Asia. So hopefully my remarks will be complementary to Jonathan's. And I hope I don't disappoint. I will try to be provocative, call out the elephant in the room, and stimulate a discussion so we can get some good questions and conversation. Although I think that both Robert and Jonathan rightly pointed out that the pivot to Asia was initially enunciated by Secretary Clinton in the foreign policy article, and of course President Obama in his speech to the Australian Parliament. I think when we talk about how China looked at this, the Chinese really found the origins earlier. And it goes back to a speech that Secretary Clinton gave in 2010, where she talked about the return to Southeast Asia, which ultimately became referred to in Chinese as the return to Asia. And this policy was initially quite hotly debated in China. And I think initially there was an attitude of wait and see, or what the Chinese call 听其言观其行. The assessment was not initially negative, although some people saw it negatively, others did not. So, for example, in one article that was published in early 2011, probably written in late 2010, one Chinese analyst from the Institute of Contemporary International Relations wrote that the U.S. strategic goal in the Asia-Pacific region is not fundamentally in conflict with China's strategic goal, and that the U.S. return to Asia could be mutually beneficial and win-win. With the passage of time, however, most Chinese adopted a negative view of the rebalance to Asia. And the more authoritative assessments, I think, were decidedly critical. So in mid-2012, for example, there was an article by Zhong Shun, which is a pseudonym that probably represents an editorial group of the People's Daily, the party's newspaper. And it said that the strategy had the obvious feature of confrontation. And then earlier this year, there was another article by Zhong Sheng that said the Asia-Pacific rebalance, which the U.S. government has forcefully carried out in recent years, has frequently showed an intent of containment with balance of power. The rebalance is invariably now described by Chinese scholars as emboldening China's neighbors to challenge China, as driving a wedge between China and its neighbors, and as aimed at strategic encirclement of China. And there's been constant criticism in China that the rebalance is mostly manifest in the military sphere and is increasing tensions in the region. This negative view has persisted despite U.S. officials' repeated statements in speeches, which Jonathan talked about the importance of U.S.-China relations, about U.S. desire for improved relations, including the Obama administration's explicit support for building a new type of great power relationship with China, which U.S. officials have said is not a reality, but is an aspiration. So we heard former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, for example, in a speech that he gave at CSIS in November 2012, saying that pursuing a stable and constructive relationship with China is a key component of the rebalance to Asia. And a year later, National Security Advisor Susan Rice spoke at Georgetown University And she said that the U.S. wanted to operationalize the new type of major power or great power relationship with China. Now, my view is that the U.S. rebalance is related to China, but it isn't all about China. Economics, I think, is really central to the rebalance. Many of you may have read or listened to a speech that U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker gave in Tokyo earlier this month, where she referenced that the Asia-Pacific region is home to nearly 60% of global GDP, the world's fastest-growing economies, half of the world's population, and an emerging class that is hungry for American products and services. By 2030, there will be 2.7 million billion middle class, of course, consumers, billion middle class consumers in the region. So the economic well-being of the United States is inextricably linked to the Asia-Pacific, and indeed, American exports to the region are growing more quickly than to other areas of the world. Now, the timing of the announcement of the rebalance, and by the way, President Obama did say pivot.
He has used the word, but not in the Australia speech, though.
Not in the Australia speech, but later on, after Tom Donilon insisted and instructed the rest of the administration to not use the term pivot, and then the president used it.
Slip of the tongue.
Right. But I think the very public articulation of the strategy and the timing early in the Obama administration, particularly around the Secretary Clinton's speech that she gave in July of 2010 at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, in which she underscored American interests in the South China Sea. To me, this all suggests that, yes, there was an important element that related to China's ascendance, and that the primary purpose was to provide reassurance to the rest of the region that was concerned about some of China's behavior. So this, why was there this need for reassurance? And so we could go back and review some of what was going on in 2009, 2010 in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, with China interfering with exports of rare earth minerals to Japan is one example, and some of the growing tensions in South China Sea among some of the claimants, and particularly concern about some of China's activities vis-a-vis the Philippines and Vietnam. There was also China's unwillingness to criticize North Korea's provocative actions in 2010, which I think also increased uncertainty and anxiety in the region. China's use of political and economic coercion against its neighbors led many of them to reach out to the United States and call for increased U.S. involvement and presence. And I can trace this back to when Lee Kuan Yew came to the United States early, I believe it was in 2010, and he spoke at the Asia Society, so he talked about this publicly, although I understand that as in private conversations with President Obama that it was raised as well, where he explicitly called for the United States to step up its involvement in Asia. Later on, again, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon called this the demand signal from the region. And from the perspective of U.S. officials, I think ignoring this signal would have been damaging to U.S. credibility throughout the region. So in my view, reassurance is still the main purpose of the rebalance to Asia today. Regional nations want good relations with China, but they want autonomy. They want freedom of maneuver. They don't want to be bullied or forced to act against their interests. Especially for countries with territorial disputes with China, bolstering ties with the United States is a useful hedge against the possibility that China will use military, political, or economic coercion against them. Most of these nations don't want to align with the United States against China. Our allies are an exception. They want good relations with both the U.S. and China, and that's, I think, even true in the case of Japan and the Philippines. They also want the United States and China to refrain from a zero-sum competition or worse, military confrontation in their backyard. So the main challenge for the United States in implementing the rebalance, I think, lies in the perception, not just the reality, of U.S. staying power and commitment to the region. And there has been persisting angst and uncertainty about U.S. commitment and staying power, about U.S. willingness to come to the aid of its allies, to continue to play the role of guarantor of peace and stability in the region. And of course, this is particularly true with the emergence, as Jonathan talked about, of new challenges in the broader Middle East and in Europe. China knows this, and in fact tries to capitalize on the doubts that are harbored by its neighbors about the United States. Some regional diplomats privately admit that their Chinese counterparts warn them to not rely on the United States because the U.S. is far away and not so dependable. And China is also using, of course, economic carrots to woo the region, to persuade nations to align more closely with China, or at least to not align with the United States against China. So how has the rebalance affected U.S.-China relations? Has it damaged the bilateral relationship? And in particular, has it hampered bilateral cooperation? And so this is where my remarks may be a little bit provocative. I think it's hard to isolate the rebalance as an independent variable. The U.S. rebalance to Asia hasn't been the only source of tension in the relationship, so we have to start there. There have been many others, economic issues, cybersecurity, human rights. There's a long list. And I would argue that most of the decisions made by the Obama administration pertaining to Asia would likely have taken place even if there had been no declared strategy of rebalancing to Asia, because they serve U.S. interests. So U.S. support for Japan, for example, statements that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands are covered under the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty because they are administered by Japan, they would have happened anyway. In fact, that policy predated the Obama administration. It wasn't a new position. A more active U.S. policy to advance U.S. interests and preserve peace and stability in the South China Sea, I think would have occurred in the absence of an announced pivot to Asia. But I think we can still try to speculate, has the rebalance affected the U.S.-China relationship, and if so, how? So first, I would say that the U.S. rebalance to Asia has increased China's overall suspicions of U.S. intentions toward China, toward the region. It has heightened fears that the United States does not want to see a strong and powerful China. So the rebalance has contributed to growing mistrust. Secondly, the rebalance has likely contributed to an increase in negative Chinese public attitudes toward the United States. So I would cite, for example, the Pew Research Center poll found that the percentage of Chinese respondents who view the U.S.-China relationship as hostile rose from 8% in 2010 to 26% in 2012. The role of public opinion in Chinese decision-making, of course, is unclear, so it is difficult to judge whether this really has had a negative impact on the relationship in terms of putting pressure on Chinese leadership in the decisions that it makes in policy toward the U.S. But I think we can say it has certainly hardened Chinese public attitudes. Now, in the military sphere, despite U.S. rotation of troops through Darwin and increased missile defense cooperation with Japan, the agreement with Manila to expand access to U.S. forces and expanded military cooperation between the U.S. and the Philippines and Vietnam, the U.S.-China military relationship has improved, as Jonathan has already talked about. There's been more candid dialogue. There has been an uptick in military exchanges, joint exercises, and confidence-building measures that will be rolled out when President Obama is in Beijing meeting with President Xi Jinping. So even as the Chinese military builds and deploys capabilities aimed at denying the U.S. access to its near seas in a crisis, and the United States continues to develop capabilities to counter Chinese capabilities and ensure U.S. access in a crisis, nevertheless, there's concrete progress that's being taken in the military relationship, and particularly to avoid miscalculation and accidents. And it's notable, we've been talking with the Chinese about this since 1998, but we are making progress now. On specific issues such as North Korea, if the rebalance had not taken place, would Chinese cooperation have been greater? I have my doubts. China's policies towards North Korea, I think, are based on long-standing interests, preservation of stability in North Korea and along the border, the desire for a buffer, and while at the same time, of course, wanting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. And China has become more vocal in its calls for denuclearization of North Korea. But the policy, I think, hasn't fundamentally changed. China's willingness to pressure North Korea remains limited. And it's affected by other factors, such as whether China perceives the political regime in North Korea as fragile. China is more willing to press North Korea when it thinks that there is stability and less willing to do so. For example, after Jang Sung-taek was executed, and then the China-North Korea relationship was fragile, as well as the political stability inside North Korea. So I would question whether, in the absence of the rebalance to Asia and the negative attitudes that China subsequently had toward it, whether we would have seen greater cooperation. Was China's decision to establish an East China Sea air defense identification zone a reaction to the rebalance? Probably not. In fact, the proposal was put forward by the PLA Air Force beginning in 2008, before the Obama administration's rebalance. Hu Jintao did not support it. Xi Jinping allowed it to go forward. And he probably wanted to win greater PLA backing for a host of reasons. Have tensions between the U.S. and China increased over Taiwan because of the rebalance? No. The Obama administration sold a significant amount of weapons to Taiwan in 2010 and 2011 and encouraged Taiwan to pursue an asymmetrical strategy and develop its own anti-access area denial strategy. In fact, I would say it's arguable that the U.S. rebalance, by providing reassurance, has increased Taipei's confidence to negotiate with the mainland and has been a factor in the maintenance of stability across the strait. So my conclusion is that the rebalance has soured Chinese attitudes towards the U.S., but it has not substantially undermined U.S.-Chinese cooperation, and I would welcome other views. Moreover, the tensions that have arisen in the Asia-Pacific region have been due not to the rebalance, but more importantly, to China's policies. So we can go into details about Scarborough Shoal. In 2012, the first change in hands of a land feature from one nation or one claimant to another since the late 90s. Second Thomas Shoal, where China has interfered with some of the resupply operations to the Filipino Marines that are deployed on a rusted-out ship there. I already mentioned the ADIZ. Then, of course, we have the oil rig deployment off the coast of the Paracels and in Vietnam's EEZ. Were Chinese actions in those instances a reaction to the rebalance? I doubt it. I think other factors were at play. As China has amassed greater power, it is determined to right the wrongs of the past, as they see it. Xi Jinping has emphasized China will not compromise on sovereignty issues and has gone beyond China has gone beyond what I would say was reactive assertiveness for a time to a more proactive assertiveness. And this is part of a generally more proactive foreign policy that is aimed at more actively defending and advancing Chinese interests. So I don't think it can be explained as a reaction to the rebalance. So is the rebalance a success? Well, if you accept that the main goal was reassurance of U.S. commitment and staying power, then that reassurance is an ongoing process. This is a goal the administration, any administration, works at every day. It's really never attainable. Nevertheless, I believe that the rebalance did have some efficacy in the first term of President Obama's administration. The U.S. rebalance helped to assuage some of the doubts in the region about U.S. commitment and staying power for a time. But in 2013, worries began to rise again. And at first, the spike in concern was due to the change in personalities in the administration. But later, it was a function of, I think, more important factors, such as Obama's decision to not use force in Syria, despite the government's crossing of its own red line of the use of chemical weapons by the government. Then we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course, the challenge posed by ISIS in the Middle East. Even before that, we had sequestration, the temporary shutdown of the U.S. government, which caused President Obama to cancel his trip to APEC and EAS last year. And that also influenced perceptions. So today, countries, I think, once again view the United States as distracted, and they are worried about the future of the rebalanced Asia. Many Chinese appear to be gleeful about this development. Some Chinese experts have asked me whether the U.S. will be bogged down in the Middle East for another decade. U.S. distraction from Asia, I think, would provide Beijing with more room to maneuver as the first decade that we were distracted in the Middle East, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. Worries about U.S. staying power in the region might make some smaller nations more likely to accommodate to Chinese interests. And obviously, this would be to China's advantage. So I'd like to close with 2 points. First, I believe both the economic dynamism of the Asia-Pacific and the challenges and opportunities posed by China's rise will likely ensure that the rebalanced Asia remains on the U.S. policy agenda. Where the policy will sit on that agenda remains to be seen, however. The TPP, which will be discussed later this afternoon, I think will be a very important factor going forward. If concluded successfully, it will be a shot in the arm. It will, I think, strengthen confidence in the U.S. throughout the region. If it fails, it could be the death knell of the strategy, and it could open the door to greater Chinese influence. Second, if China returns to a good neighborly policy toward the region, the reassurance element of the rebalance will be less necessary. And there will be greater potential for a more positive-sum relationship between the U.S. and China in the Asia-Pacific region, rather than the dynamics that I think we see today, which in my view are primarily zero-sum. And in that case, the rebalance will have been a success, because after all, the rebalance is not aimed at containing or strategically encircling China. It is aimed at influencing China's policy choices so that peace and stability can continue to prevail in East Asia. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. Both of your remarks on the rebalance, and then we're hearing a lot more, I think, in the lead up to the APEC meeting. We'll hear more certainly from Xi about the major, the new model of major power relations. And these kinds of formulations have me wishing that we would just sort of scrap the formulas and simply return to U.S.-China relations. This is all-encompassing. It admits of infinite complexity. It's neutral, it's perfectly serviceable, and it doesn't raise any suspicions. And I think that we should, maybe starting here today at the Wilson Center, just know new model of major power relations, no rebalance, just 中美关系, just U.S.-China relations, I think covers it.
Back to basics.
Back to basics. I have a question I'd like to pose first to the two of you before we open it up to the audience. And you spoke at the end about the possibility of positive sum. We're watching China. We're watching its moves with the ADIZ, with the fishing zone, with the so-called salami slicing strategy, with increasingly the formation of new international institutions, which may or may not pose a threat to the existing infrastructure. And my question is, what is it exactly that we are afraid of or worry about vis-a-vis China in the long run if China more or less had its way? And the reason I ask this is because it seems confusing to many people in China who say, we are but a simple, developing, peace-loving country that never interferes in the internal affairs of anybody else. We've done nothing to threaten freedom of navigation in the area. You are more than welcome through trade relationships to benefit from the increasing economic development in the region. China's emergence as the most important Asian country is natural, inevitable, and desirable. What do we think that left unchecked or unbalanced China would achieve if it could? How bad would that be? And how much should we therefore be willing to expend to counter it? China, I think to this credit, they do articulate their concerns vis-a-vis containment, encirclement. This doesn't ring true to us, but I think we have a pretty good sense of what they worry about vis-a-vis us. Many of our representations to them clearly come from a deep suspicion about China's intentions or what it might do, but that we never quite articulate. Would we be doing them, perhaps ourselves, the relationship a favor if we could name that? So how do you see, what's the worst they could do? It's a big question, but I think it's one of the elephants in the room. And maybe Bonnie, if I could throw that to you first, and then Jonathan, and then we'll go out to the audience.
Sure. I'm not so sure that we don't articulate this. I think that increasingly people are stating quite clearly what the concerns are. So if you start with the military realm, and I referred to this in my remarks, there is concern that Chinese capability will make it so risky for the United States to operate, gain access, and have operational maneuverability within the region in a crisis, that we wouldn't be able to come to the aid of our allies. I think that is very much a concern of the United States, since we do have obligations in that region. People speak, I think, generally about the desire that China may have, and this is allegedly, to have the United States return to its own side of the Pacific. Chinese leaders and officials tell us that's not China's goal, that they welcome a constructive involvement of the United States in the region. But I think people do have these concerns. I think more broadly, people are talking about the worries that exist about China undermining the post-Cold War, post-World War II international structures. There's a very interesting report that was just released by the Mercator Institute, and it's a good graphic that shows the parallel structures that China has been creating. And there's a number of them. It goes back to the Chiang Mai initiative, but we have more recently the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank. Then we have the CICA and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So increasingly people worry in the economic realm about whether the Bretton Woods system being undermined. There's a whole range of areas that I think people worry that China's not happy with the current system. It seems it unjust and unfair, and not only wants to reasonably reform it, but wants to create parallel structures and maybe create a system in which China's interests are prevail over others. Now, I would caveat that by saying that China has, in some cases, not been permitted to have that seat at the table, such as the agreed upon change in the voting shares at the IMF, which sits in our Congress and has not yet been ratified. So I'm not saying these are necessarily unreasonable. In some cases, it might be quite understandable. First of all, that China is now a bigger player and should have a say in how some of these structures operate, and in ways that they were unfair, should have a say in how they might be reformed. And then there are areas in which there are no guidelines or no laws. If we look at cyberspace, and absolutely China should be at the table to discuss those. So I'm not being critical in that regard. But I think these are the kinds of things that people worry about.
Jonathan.
I think that there are a variety of areas of unease, some of them articulated, some of them not articulated. That on the one hand, there is a recognition that there's an inevitability to China becoming the world's biggest economic power. That's a function of arithmetic more than anything else, as well as economic success. But it's an unease that underlying it, that this is some, spoken or unspoken, this is a recalibration of power relationships in the international system that discomfits people, I think. A belief that somehow, under these circumstances, China would use its power in ways that would either be direct challenges to American interests, or more specifically would undermine the position and security of U.S. partners and allies in Asia. I don't want to call it a nightmare scenario, but it's this feeling that at the end of the day, we are really at cross purposes with China. There may be words that sound reassuring, but what do they mean in practice? Is there a presumption that longer term China's aspirations could be congruent with an existing international order, even though the United States repeatedly, and I think this includes President Obama, has recognized that we've got an old set of relationships that can't stand forever. They've got to be adjusted to reflect new realities. I don't think that that's such an unusual thought. But can we come to that kind of a meeting of the minds with China, or with maybe making it more specific with the individual who is leading China at the present time? It's funny. The United States goes through fatalistic circles about its future. If we were all gathered here in the late 1980s, the pessimism and declinism that was everywhere evident, of course. Who was the big threat to the United States? Japan. George Friedman and his wife wrote a book about the coming war between the United States and Japan. It has a kind of a quaint feel to that, after the years, as we looked for the fact that we overstated significantly what Japan's capacities were going to be, and so forth. I use that as an example because the United States is so comfortable in a world where its power is so singular, where its dominance is so unquestioned, and we're moving not only just with China, but with others as well. That if they are able to fulfill their longer-term goals, India would be a good example of this. We're headed into a world where our power, our influence, the impact of our ideas, of our technology, and so forth, all of this will matter hugely, but our power will be less singular. But can we look at that and say, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
I think this is why we need to be more specific with China, because it gives non-specificity gives Chinese critics a hook in which to say this is really about America's own fear of loss of primacy, and it's about maintaining its prerogatives. Right. And this furthermore blinds America to Chinese virtue. And Chinese virtue lies at the heart of, some Chinese critics talk about a Tianxia system or a Wang Dao system in which China is able to have its influence because everybody recognizes that China is the good and they aspire to that. And there is this cultural component. I
Yes.
think we
Yes.
increasingly see, perhaps understandably, that China's default and preferred, and I think this is one of the things that worries us too, we need to be specific about it, that China's preferred mode for dealing with individuals, information, and institutions in the international realm are the modes with which it deals with them domestically. And this is not acceptable to us as international standards.
You're right.
If we don't interfere with your internal affairs, do what you want. But your ways of dealing with information, institutions, and individuals domestically cannot become international standards. So I think we need to find a language for this. Now, we're going to open it up. Do we have mics? We do on the side. I ask, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, please put the question part at the front of your statement. We'll get right down to that. And then short answers. So quick, short questions, and then short answers. Let's try to keep the answers limited to a minute if we can. There's a lot to say. So I will call you, sir, number one. Quick questions.
And they
Thank
should
you.
identify themselves.
And please identify yourselves. Yes.
My name is Tatsuya Mizumoto from Jiju Press, Japanese Wire Service. Thank you very much for today's opportunity. I want to ask about U.S.-China leaders the meeting next month, and what is the predictable achievement which both leaders could get, and then what is the president's reaction to Asian Infrastructure Invest Bank? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Quickly.
Those are two different questions. On the first, it would seem to me that the issue at the Xi-Obama meeting is, can the two leaders come out of that agreement, out of that meeting, with some specified set of directions and goals that are deemed realistic and achievable for the last 2 years of the Obama administration?
Okay, second question.
And on AIB, it's to be determined. I think that the administration has often been, in its public stance, a bit rigid about, they're in between positions. You don't have to be a member of the bank, but you have to see whether or not this bank would in fact fulfill our expectations about governance and relationships and so forth in a way that would be augmenting existing international institutions rather than challenging them.
Bonnie, best possible outcome of a Xi-Obama meeting?
I think that meetings between presidents are part of a process. So dialogue continues to be important. I think that the presidents will try to expand cooperation in areas where we actually have convergent or overlapping interests. And there's a broad number of issues that we actually do have overlapping interests and even objectives, but it's the approaches that often differ. And so trying to find ways where we might be able to work together on Afghanistan or fighting Ebola in Africa and climate change. I think those are very important. So I think we can have some agreements. Maybe we will be able to reassure our respective publics, as well as the region that is anxious about U.S.-Chinese competition, and we can begin to build some momentum. And so I would emphasize, again, the importance under the Bush administration of working with China on, for example, North Korea, and even having some dealing in a parallel way, not cooperatively, on Taiwan and concerns about Chen Shui-bian, that I think really began to build some confidence in the relationship. And so we need a success.
Okay. We had side-by-side questions here. 1, 2.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an Intel analyst. There's zero doubts that these island disputes are going to result in bloodshed someday. Isn't it time for some adult supervision for the administration to stop being completely reactive all the time and call for an international conference to divvy up these islands? Maybe you can divide the islands. Maybe you can give the mineral resources to one guy and the fishing rights to a third guy and the rock itself, to somebody else. Those kinds of formulas to finally divide up these islands so that there isn't the inevitable bloodshed.
Is there an American role in these processes? What should it be? Again, it's all these are very complicated issues. It could be a whole day conference.
I'm going to go first.
Right.
The problem is that there is no supranational way of divvying it up. It's not the U.S. role to divvy up these islands or to solve the fishery problems. It must be the worked out between the claimants and those that are in that the immediate region. So the United States can help. We don't take a position on sovereignty, nor should we. So that then takes us to the issue of international law, which I think can play a role. It can't solve everything. Personally, I think it would be great if the claimants took it to the International Court of Justice, and then the sovereignty issues could be worked out, and then the ITLOS tribunal, if needed, could determine which ones are islands and get 200-mile EEZs, and which ones are rocks and get 12-mile territorial seas, the International Tribunal and the law of the sea. So, yeah, international tribunals and law can play a role, but right now very few countries want to use them, and China has little confidence in them. So I don't see any way of resolving this sovereignty dispute in the near future, and it's very difficult to even engage in joint development when there's such heated differences over sovereignty issues.
Just very, very quickly, again, most of international relations is not resolving conflict, it's managing them. And I take your point that there would always be the concern about the inevitability that there would be blood in the water, which is not something that the United States seeks. We have enough areas where there is blood being shed in the world that we don't want to add East Asia into that mix. I would, though, say that it's interesting here that, of course, China claims, as do others, indisputable sovereignty over islands in the South China Sea, at the same time that, for example, Japan claims indisputable sovereignty over the Senkaku's Diaoyus. In a perfect world, you would get mutual consent that would acknowledge we're not going to agree on this, but you find some means by which you can come to some kind of arrangements that A, avoid conflict, and B, maybe allow for some kind of mutual economic gain. But those are, again, that's very aspirational. Fundamentally, it's got to be the avoidance of armed conflict, because I think if there is meaningful armed conflict in any of these situations, we are in a very, very different and deeply troubled world in East Asia, beyond the current uncertainties.
Yes, you've got the mic.
David Sedney, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. My question for both of you is does a rebalance make sense? And the background to that is in 2000, we had an administration come into office pledging to do a lot more with Asia. Great Asianists like Rich Armitage, Jim Kelly, a Deputy Secretary of State later on, Bob Zellick, who was going to have China become a responsible stakeholder. And so that was but at the end, as you've described, it was seen as not having done enough and lost power, lost influence in Asia. Now we have an administration that has a rebalance policy that perhaps at best has soured relations with China and may increase distrust in the U.S.'s reliability. Are we on the wrong track by seeking to rebalance? Is this whole idea of a separate policy like this, does it really make sense?
I think we've covered a lot of the range of the answers to this question, but is there anything that really puts a point on it for either of you?
David, I take your point. I mean, I think that the problem is that as long as the United States remains a global power, this notion that we are going to privilege one area relative to other kinds of areas, I think, at the end of the day, proves fanciful. It's not to say that each is equivalent in their own ways, but if we could find a way that administrations avoid all the labels, avoid the bumper stickers, we'd probably be better off. And that's why Robert's suggestion, profound insight of saying, why don't we just call it U.S.-China, may have some, and in fact, I dare say if we were to do that, some in China would say, what's the angle here? What's the, so.
Yeah, I actually think we should call it the new type of U.S.-China relations, because that's really what it's all about. But David, I take your point. I agree with Jonathan, but I think the reason, again, why this was so publicly enunciated is because of the required reassurance. Yeah. And it did not have to be done so publicly. It just could have been a set of policies as it was in the prior administration. But I think that this was what Kurt Campbell, Hillary Clinton were trying to do. Was
There's a desire to put a marker down of some
reassure
kind, right?
the region that the U.S. was going to be committed. And of course, when you do something very publicly like that, then you raise expectations that are so hard to meet. And so at the end of the day, I think it's inevitable you look back on it and say, sure, it could be success for a while, but it couldn't be successful forever. Because other things happen and you get distracted or you don't have the resources or whatever. So in retrospect, there were some problems, but then again, at the time, it did seem like the public nature of it was important and served its purposes for at least for a while.
Yes. I'm looking for and not finding a woman with her hand in the air. Yes, sir.
Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. I'd like to go back to what Bonnie said at the end, that if China had a more diplomatic policy towards its neighbors, that the U.S. could cooperate with them. I think that that does exist, and it exists in the two Silk Roads that have become kind of the hallmark of Xi Jinping, in which they're trying to use their economic power to develop their neighbors. Yesterday, Wang Yi indicated again that this is an open and inclusive proposal, and I understand that there was even a Chinese delegation here in the U.S. To discuss at the White House and the State Department the notion of this Silk Road to bring the United States into collaboration with this. And my question is, would this not be the type of thing that the U.S. could engage in, not in the sense of your Silk Road versus our Silk Road, but in terms of building a Silk Road for development for the region together with China to try and create the kind of rapport that one needs? And secondly, in relationship to the AIIB, which I guess was discussed earlier before I got in here, this is generally considered as undermining the Bretton Woods institutions, but the president of the World Bank has himself said that he is in favor of this because anybody who's going to give credit to infrastructure investment is doing a good thing.
There's not enough question.
Of it. And the question is, wouldn't the AIIB be something to support, given that the institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, have become more debt collectors than debt issuers at this point? Because isn't this what the world would need?
Can we support the AIIB?
Well, we'll find out. I guess I mean, we're obviously those in the administration feel that it's just way premature to make a set of judgments here. But I think that this really calls upon for a set of discussions with the relevant Chinese who will oversee this institution. It doesn't require us to join it in some sense right away. There needs to be clarification. It's like so many initiatives involving China. It's not to cast immediate suspicions. It's more to simply say we need more information. We need more understanding, and we need a better ability to have access and disclosure on the part of Chinese policymakers and institutions if we're going to feel comfortable sufficiently with goals, purposes, and possibilities.
I think the Obama administration faced a choice. It wanted to influence China to adopt good governance criteria for lending, and given China's track record in lending and aid, it hasn't been willing to adopt at least the Western sort of formulations. And so ultimately, the choice was made, I think, to sit on the sidelines and see how this Asian investment bank really gets started. I don't think the administration has ruled out joining. Certainly Australia and South Korea have not ruled out joining. But at the end of the day, there are, I think, reasonable concerns about some of these sort of good governance criteria for lending. I don't know whether the United States really wants to get involved in Chinese-style, large-scale programs like the One Road, One Belt. That's not to say it's a bad thing. These are great for China and its neighbors. We engage with the region differently economically, for better or worse. But I also think we have to be candid about what some of China's goals are and the way that it pursues these. China doesn't really have zero conditions for its economic engagement and rewards to the region. If you're sitting in the Philippines, you perfectly understand how economic pressure and coercion have been used against you. Most recently, once again, China decided that the tourist groups can't go to the Philippines from China, and we saw the quarantine of bananas and other tropical fruit. So if a country behaves according to the way China wants, it gets lots of benefits. And that is part of what this One Road, One Belt is all about, is to have the region accommodate to Chinese interest, or at least to not damage Chinese interests. So this is not something I think the United States really sort of wants to be part of.
But cognizant of the concerns that both of you have raised, I first came to China in the public diplomatic sphere. Shouldn't the United States be looking for some area in which we can quite overtly acknowledge that we do welcome China as a voice in institutions, a builder of institutions, as a rule maker in a way that is a process, uncertain, where we clearly state our rules? Isn't there a value in showing that when the need for infrastructure in Asia over the next decade or two is, I believe, something around $8 trillion, we can't meet it, and we've got our president calling China a free rider? Don't we need, as a matter of long-term public diplomacy, to show an openness, which involves this frank expression of concerns?
Yes, definitely. I think what we're really talking about fundamentally here is statements or actions that would legitimate, that the United States would be on record as legitimating various kinds of roles that China would assume without having to be involved in it in every intricate detail. But otherwise, I mean, you know, if we're headed toward a world where there are all these profound problems, profound needs, where else is it going to come from? Would we rather, frankly, I mean, apropos of the AIIB, would we rather that China build, let's say, you know, X number more aircraft carriers, or would you rather have them invest in infrastructure?
I just want to say just a couple of sentences. I completely agree with you. But then the question is that I want to ask is, could China have gone about this differently? Okay, so China could have gone to the Asia Development Bank and said, you focus mostly on poverty reduction, but you also do infrastructure, because, by the way, they do $10 billion in infrastructure lending. And they could have said, why don't we open a window that will focus on infrastructure, and China will help to support that. It could have been done within the existing system. China's really hostile relations with Japan made that probably impossible. But even if that relationship had been in a good place, I doubt that Beijing would have done it that way.
But even the existing, I mean, somebody just mentioned, you know, Robert Zellick, responsible stakeholder, and this suggests, again, to Chinese ears, that you are welcome as long as you play by these rules. And we're all familiar with this argument, and surely, with all of our legitimate concerns and the processes that could be better run, there are going to have to be some kinds of accommodations, some kinds
I made
of
that point earlier.
Yeah, so
China has to be a rule maker, not just
so
a
we
rule
define
taker.
spaces.
Completely agree.
Anyway, other questions. Right in the middle, in black. Yes, you.
Thank you. I'm Marco Oliveros. I'm a student from American University, and I also happen to be a Wilson Center intern. My question is, generally there seems to be a prevailing three points when it comes to viewing China's increasingly proactive role in the Asia-Pacific. One being China wants to be more represented. Two being China is more ambitious. And three being that there's a sort of fight between the different bureaucracies of China as to what it wants to do and become within the region. My reason and rationale for that being...
We've got 8 minutes, so question.
Right. My rationale being China's role in the maritime disputes and its schizophrenic sort of messaging systems between the Chinese fisheries and Chinese surveillance organizations and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Is there a question there?
A comment on the bureaucracy portion, like in a matter of that bureaucracies are fighting out for each other, and there's no
We-
Chinese monolith.
And maybe we sometimes see claims that we can't respond to every Chinese action as a Beijing policy because there isn't necessarily control over fill in the blank localities, the PLA.
Well, yes. No, I mean, look, the questions of bureaucratic coordination in any large system are inherently problematic endeavors. In the Chinese case, I mean, you have a new leader who is trying to, if you will, re-aggregate a lot of power that has devolved to different institutions. We'll see how he does. But here again, this is where I think the differences in the political cultures of the United States and China are a limiting factor. We talk, we disclose, we reveal. It's just so inherent in the way Americans go about their business, and it's in the nature of our very political system. In China, it's not so much, and how you can bridge that divide, I think, is going to be a continuing issue in the U.S.-China relationship.
So I agree that coordination continues to be a problem in any system, certainly in China. But there's also been some improvements under Xi Jinping. We see good coordination actually between some of the law enforcement ships and the military ships. In the case of when the oil rig was deployed, if you look in the East China Sea, where there has been some reduction in the frequency and numbers of ships that are sailing within the 12-mile territorial waters around the disputed island. We've seen, nevertheless, in the last few months, an uptick in very large numbers of fishing boats, been reported up to something like 1,000 fishing boats, to assert Chinese sovereignty claims and presence. So I don't want to overplay this, but there is evidence of increased coordination at the same time that, of course, there are local interests that are going to assert themselves, and maybe the PLA is occasionally doing something that Xi Jinping doesn't like. But I see greater evidence of coordination under Xi Jinping than I saw under Hu Jintao.
Last question, right up front, Irma. Yes.
Finally, lady raise a question. Yeah,
Bye,
yeah.
Jia.
My name is Bai Jie. Yeah, Bonnie's colleague. I'm the visiting fellow of CSIS. I'm from China. Actually, 1 month ago I arrived here. In China, actually, we even the academic circles and the society in our society, we pay a lot of attention about to the U.S. China-U.S. relations. even the taxi driver knows we want to establish a kind of new model of major, not power. We use major country relations with with U.S. But when I come here, I found a very interesting thing. I attend a lot of conferences or seminars related to China-U.S. relations, but this phrase rarely be mentioned. Of course, Robert Turner mentioned it in the beginning of this seminar. So my question is related to the new founded AIIB. Yeah, I heard also China's mass media also reported that the U.S. is deliberately to stop or pursue its partner to not attend AIIB. So my question is, the first one, what's the the true intention of the United States? Why you not want to involve into the actually it's a trend of the regional cooperation. If you want to return to Asia, the more you should involve yourself into that, the process of the regional cooperation. So this is the first question. The second one is, what's your true thinking of two speakers, or maybe include Robert, about the new type or new model of major country relations? What's your feelings? With worry, expectations, or some jealous? So this is the second question.
Maybe as we talked about the AIIB,
Yeah.
let's go to the second question in closing.
Yeah.
Your thinking on the new model.
Yeah, 2-1.
Part of the problem, it's what Kissinger refers to, that China likes the broad principles, the philosophical arguments, whereas America is a problem-solving culture. I think that the attitudes here, without our knowing exactly what Xi Jinping has in mind, beyond the the broad articulation of goals is, in practice, how would it make a relationship different? Can you find specific examples or areas where we could cooperate that would demonstrate, excuse me, I'm not emotionally overcome, but
The new model is so beautiful.
there has to be a ground on which we can meet rather than just simply having to subscribe to one or another of the maxims. And it's almost as if it's who gets ownership here of concepts. And I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I mean, if there are practical things the United States and China can and need to do, and I think that there are, let's do them and not overload them too much with elaborate labels.
Bonnie?
So for the very few of you who, probably handful in the audience who don't speak Chinese, major country and big power are said the same way in Chinese. So the taxi driver who is thinking about 新型大国关系, 大国, in that person's mind, I think in the minds of Chinese, correct me if you think I'm wrong, really represents big power. It's that China has arrived. It's not we're a major country just like, you know, Germany is or Japan.
But it's often 大国 as opposed to 小日本人, 小越南人.
Right, thank you. That's because his Chinese is much better than ours. So in my view, Chinese really do think of this as great country, not great power, not major country, and I think it's deliberately translated for the outside world so that the outside world won't be nervous about China trying to take over and displace the United States. So I think that's about reassurance. I like the way the administration is describing this because I think what it needs to be is you find common ground where you have overlapping interests, you try to work together and accomplish something. And where you have differences, you have to manage them. And in fact, the origins of this, let's remember when Xi Jinping came to the United States in early 2012, he focused on avoiding major conflict. This is what is referred to by Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap, rising power challenging potentially the existing power. They shouldn't go to war, and that's what we should avoid, is military conflict. And we can all get on board with that. So I think it was a mistake for Xi Jinping to specifically define this as mutual respect for each other's core interests and major concerns. Because we want to avoid war, we want win-win cooperation, but our core interests really don't completely converge. And where they diverge, we have to manage them. And so I think that it raised expectations in China. China talked about a consensus having been reached that was not. At the end of the day, it's probably created more strains in the U.S.-China relationship, has been more unhelpful. So I think that we should start talking about the new type of U.S.-China relationship.
Well, trying to distinguish between words and deeds in the context of U.S.-China relations and in the rebalance, to come back to our topic, it reminds me there's a very popular American play in China in the 80s and 90s was Death of a Salesman, 推销员之死. And there's a scene at the end of that where Willie Loman, the salesman, is talking to the son of his neighbor, and he watched the son, Bernie, grow up, and they're just having a little conversation about, you know, how's Biff, how's Happy, and then Bernie goes off, and Bernie's father, Charlie, Willie Loman's neighbor, comes up, and Charlie says, well, you know, Bernie's going down to Washington to argue a case before the Supreme Court. And Willie Loman says, the Supreme Court, and he didn't even mention it. And Charlie says, he don't have to. He's going to do it. And I think this is the approach we need to take to the relationship, forgetting about putting phrases aside. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan Pollack. Thank you very much, Bonnie Glaser, for being with us this morning.
So it's the Nike strategy, isn't it? Nike strategy, just do it.
Just do it.
Right?
Just do it.